Dungeons and Dragons. Gateway to the satanic and corrupter of souls, or a harmless game enjoyable by people of all ages. Are we as Catholics allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons, or other tabletop role-playing games? Is it morally improper to do so, morally proper, or neutral? My name is Dan, and I've been playing D&D and other tabletop role-playing games since I was a young lad. I was raised Catholic, and although I left the faith for years, I have returned, and with that, I've been examining my life and the things I choose to spend my time on. One of those things I've thought about is tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, and others. I recently read a book written by someone associated with a prominent exorcist in the Catholic Church, and it very clearly had Dungeons and Dragons listed as a risky activity that Catholics should avoid. This made me stop and think, am I in error for playing fantasy games with friends on the weekend? Is my soul imperiled by this? Or is this maybe a hasty assumption from Catholics who don't really understand tabletop RPGs? I think it's generally okay to play D&D or other similar games, and I'm going to break down the common objections along with my reasoning for why throwing math rocks with your friends while narrating fantasy stories is not an inherently evil act to partake in. But we'll also discuss some caveats or considerations that maybe you should watch out for or be aware of. These are things that are valid concerns for a Christian playing these games. Quick disclaimer. The Catholic Church has not made an official pronouncement specifically about tabletop role-playing games. I'm sharing my own opinions and research here. Take it with an appropriately sized grain of salt. Objection 1. Dungeons and Dragons involves the occult, demons, necromancy, and magic. So this objection is basically saying that RPGs involve the occult, demons, magic, etc., and that this either desensitizes the players to the risks of such things, or teaches actual magical/satanic practices to players. The claim that it teaches these things is absurd on its face to anyone who's played in any sort of typical high fantasy RPG. The actual mechanics of the magic that magically inclined characters use is largely hand-waved away. Magic is treated much more like some sort of mysterious technology with a certain number of slots, or charges, per day generally. A lot of the magic in these games comes from roots in pulpy fiction novels like Jack Vance's. It doesn't really follow guidelines or rubrics similar to those of real-world occultists. In cases where characters do have to do something concrete with magic in the game, this tends to be an excuse for the GM to send the players on some sort of fetch quest or engage in problem solving. There are some exceptions to this in some smaller or indie games. Some of these do have influences from actual occultists like Crowley, paganism, or neo-paganist sorts of practice like Wicca. I'd say these games should probably be approached with caution and some discretion due to the normalization of actual occult practices, but mostly because it's kind of cringe. Like, why pretend to be some derivation of Sabrina the Teenage Witch when you could be a jacked orc with an axe? Then another part of this objection is more concerned with the demonic. And this is an interesting objection with some history behind it. Devils and demons have long been part of the standard tropes included in Dungeons and Dragons. In-game, they're tangible, horrifying, and objectively evil beings. This was a big part of what led to D&D being included in the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. And it also led the publisher to go through a weird period where they stopped calling them devils and demons, and gave them some goofy made-up new names like Batezu and Tanahari or something like that. Their existence in the narratives doesn't really bother me. Heroes need bad guys, and these are perfectly fine bad guys in a fantasy story. Their names and appearances are sourced from a variety of mythological sources, which include Tolkien's works and world religions. The authors of D&D were grabbing stuff from all kinds of mythology here. They weren't trying to insert actual Satanism into a tabletop game. Upon some reflection on my own part, I think the only possible harm here is the depiction of the demonic primarily as a tangible, physically violent evil. The heroes physically confront and vanquish them in dramatic combats, but I think this could lead to a sort of confused thinking about the demonic from a younger person or poorly catechized Catholic. Because the Church teaches that the enemy is real and present in the world, but we don't have to deal with sentient hyena demons with magical voice mimicry powers. The far more present threat in our lives is a gentle whisper stoking the flames of pride, lust, or other negative traits. Perhaps a cocky little thought of, I know better than the church. This sin is fine when I do it. This scope narrowing and physicalization of the demonic is present in a lot of modern media. It's an interesting trend, and I'll likely do a full-length video about just this topic in the future. And really the consideration or defense against this is some attention paid to the study of spiritual warfare and an understanding of the faith. Turns out proper catechesis solves a variety of issues. Objection number 2. RPGs teach polytheism and blasphemy. So the high fantasy settings in most tabletop RPGs are typically polytheistic. In these settings, people tend to venerate one or several deities out of a pretty large pantheon of gods. Seems blasphemous on its face, but I don't find it to be particularly offensive. Firstly, to Catholic scholastic traditions, polytheism is not a serious threat or even a serious idea. St. Aquinas had some good summations of these arguments, which I'll paraphrase. Essentially, if there were multiple gods, they would have something which distinguishes them. And since God is by nature infinite, all-powerful, and perfect, then some of these gods would differ from the others and therefore not be God. We could go deeper into this, but if you look further back, you'll even find Greek philosophers like Plato beginning to question polytheism, even if, at that time, they didn't have the fullness of revelation through Christ, needed to come all the way to the correct conclusions. The second reason I don't find this offensive is the character of the deities themselves. They're generally limited in scope, explicitly non-omnipotent, and often downright goofy. In Galarian, which is the default setting for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the game I currently run, there are some truly wacky gods. I have a player in my party playing a champion, which is this game's equivalent of a paladin or a divine holy warrior. He's a champion of Caden Kalian. Caden is the deity of alcohol, freedom, and bravery, whose followers build shrines in taverns. Despite the similarities to some groups of Irish Catholics I've encountered, I think it's pretty clear that these are deities created imaginatively to generate fun story hooks and not any serious attempt at theology. I suppose a practical consideration involving religion and role-playing games would be that one could approach a certain line if a large percentage of your playing session was about the mechanics of worshipping these non-existent deities. But that's something entirely controllable by the group you're playing with. In my games, we gloss over these specific details, in part because it would be weird and possibly blasphemous, and in part because that would take away from more fun activities, like meeting strange otherworldly creatures and sometimes hitting them with giant swords. And speaking of violence, we have our third objection. Objection 3. D&D teaches or encourages the acting out of immoral behavior. So this objection hinges on the idea that the normal high fantasy adventure in these games is chock full of violence. Combat is a solution to many problems, and players have the freedom to do immoral things. We're all familiar with the tropes about the party's rogue stealing everything not nailed down, or the bard who seduces everything in sight. And yeah, that can happen. If you want to play a game about immoral degenerates being degenerates, there is every opportunity in a tabletop role-playing game to do so. But there are simple solutions to this. Firstly, I tend to have a talk with my players before our first session. I explain we're telling a story, and I say, hey, we're telling a story about heroes, so no one is playing an evil character, and we're going to keep a generally positive tone. And the content of the game is typically going to sit around a PG-13 rating. An open conversation early on alleviates issues of immoral or excessively adult content before it ever comes up. But here's the thing with immoral or violent behavior when you put options in front of a reasonably well-adjusted group of humans. Not only will they seek peace sometimes, but players in games I've run consistently try to have their characters do the right thing. Sure, part of the draw of the game is a power fantasy, where your characters level up and grow stronger over time, but another thing that draws people to the game is the ability to shape an imaginary fantasy world. I have had so many instances in games I run where my lovely players will derail the whole thing to be nice to an NPC or non-player character. That spooky ghost who doesn't understand they're dead and wants to trap the players in a scriptorium to copy manuscripts forever? They found a way to break the news to it gently and help it move on. The deranged, cursed hermit hunting humans in the woods. He wasn't in his right mind. We can fix him, they said. And they did. They're friends now. The rhino-sized snapping turtle who lives outside their settlement and eats livestock, who presents a clear risk to the village's farmers and children. If we use magic to speak with him, we can set some ground rules and live peaceably along one another. And now they have a giant turtle friend I have to roleplay as when they talk to him, and also describe how he trundles into town for certain holidays that they've instituted so that the village children can marvel at him. I could go on for 10 minutes about silly, nice things my players have done, where they make good moral choices when they could use violence or skullduggery to solve a problem. But I'd love to see your examples of this happening. Leave a comment with the wackiest good deed you've seen players do in an RPG you were playing, and I'll leave a bonus story in the comments too. So to wrap this objection up, I don't think RPGs encourage or teach immorality inherently. It depends fully on the people playing the game and the choices they make. So the consideration here is just to make sure you're on the same page with your group, and that they're not just there to be obscene lunatics or degens. Objection 4. Waste of time or fruitless escapism. The last objection we're going to cover is that even if Dungeons & Dragons isn't flat out evil to play, it's such a pointless waste of time that we, as people attempting to be moral, should avoid it. And to that, I'm going to invoke a champion of fantasy. Our hero J.R.R. Tolkien himself, author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, amongst other works. If fantasy stories are silly, then Tolkien is silly. And dear viewers, Tolkien is not silly. He was a devout Catholic and a highly learned man. He specifically addressed the value of fantasy in a lecture he gave, and later wrote into an essay called On Fairy Stories. I could do a whole video about that lecture, maybe I will, but there are 3 key good things he sees in fantasy. He states that we get value out of fantasy because it provides a reasonable escape, which can be healthy. In the same way that a prisoner might escape in their own mind while in a drear and dull place, we can temporarily escape the limitations of our world through the form of fantasy. Tolkien tells us that we can also get a sense of recovery, or a capacity to see the world through renewed eyes by having fantasy, which helps us to see truth and beauty in the world. In his words, we need in any case to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness of familiarity. The last value he sees is that of consolation, or what he calls eucatastrophe, which he defines as a sudden turn from catastrophe towards joy or redemption. This value especially, I think, is present in tabletop RPGs. Anyone who has played them has been there as the party desperately claws their way back during a hard fight or dangerous situation, and there's this feeling of immense relief afterwards that's lovely, and shared by the whole group, this sense of, wow, we made it out of that, what a relief. And the last Tolkien quote I'll cite here is my absolute favorite. He says that when we create fantasy, we imitate God in our own very humble way, because we are engaging in an act of creation. He puts it thusly: fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image of a maker. How incredible is that? I think we've covered the value of fantasy pretty thoroughly with my shameless appeal to authority via Tolkien. But what about the idea that these games are a waste of time? Well, to that I'd say that leisure is absolutely something God wants us to do. In Genesis 2, we're told that the 7th day is for rest and blessed. Ecclesiastes 3:12 and 13. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. And if recreation is something allowable to man, then I would submit that recreation where we can spend time also with friends is even better. Role-playing games are community activities that allow us a fun but structured outlet with people we enjoy. The consideration to this point is that we should keep gaming, of any variety, in a proper and appropriate place in our lives. Our nature as humans, and sometimes as nerds, is that we can fixate on things, and there are more important things in life than RPGs. If tabletop gaming is taking attention from the necessary work you have to do, or, more pertinently to this video, from time you're spending for God, then maybe it's time to reevaluate some priorities. If you're playing in 2 to 3 games a week at 4 hours apiece, but your only Christian activity regularly in your week is on Sunday for about an hour, then I'm not your dad, but maybe you should schedule some more time for God and less time for fantasy. Overall, it's my opinion that there's no valid reason to not play Dungeons & Dragons or other fantasy role-playing games as a Catholic or as a Christian. We should just take into account some basic considerations, like understanding these games do not contain accurate representations of theology, religion, or the demonic, and we should choose to play with people who have a desire to make a generally wholesome and not obscene story. Plus, we have strong support from Tolkien that fantasy is a valid form of entertainment. I think the bias against D&D comes from the 80s and 90s satanic panic, a cultural movement that had some good points, but executed them terribly, and with a strong lack of understanding of much of the material being condemned. To anyone who still has nagging doubts that role-playing games are a tool of the enemy, or can really actively lead a person astray, I'd highly encourage you to look a little further, and maybe someday give them a try. They're a ton of fun, and I look forward every week to hanging out with my friends and getting all fired up over some math rocks and imaginary heroes. Thanks for hanging out. Remember, God loves you, even if you've no-call, no-showed to gaming sessions with your friends. Take care.